and welcome back to What's the Plan, the podcast where we dive into the matters of our careers in the architecture and planning world. I'm Hayley.
And I'm Andrea. So, Hayley, what's the plan this week?
This week's plan is all about public transportation.
Yeah, so as someone who grew up in the suburbs and then lived in downtown Toronto for like about 5 years, and then now moving back to the suburbs, I feel like my relationship with public transit has fluctuated quite a lot throughout the years.
Yeah, same.
However, I know for you, Hayley, ever since you got into planning, you've always been like a very strong advocate for transit. What was your perception of public transportation prior to university?
Yeah, so I would say growing up, I think especially because of the area we lived in, it was like as we mentioned in previous episodes, I guess we could say upper middle class area. I've always viewed public transit as a last resort. I think with so many of the people around us having either access to a vehicle themselves or access to a parent or guardian or like an older sibling that has access to a vehicle that could drive them around, I think barely anyone I knew ever took public transit. And so I always grew up with a mindset that public transit shouldn't be a priority, both for riders and for cities, like to invest in.
Yeah.
And to add to that, I think because we live in such a car-oriented area, more often than not, I actually hear that public transit is viewed as a hindrance than a pro of any kind. Specifically for bus rapid transits with designated bus lanes, I always hear that specifically construction on these lanes are such a big problem for car owners and people who just drive or use vehicles regularly.
Especially since they take forever to be built. Like, I remember hearing that, like, oh, this is going to be, like, construction for 10 years on this street.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so as the naive little child as I was, I believed that this was the correct mentality to have. But as you mentioned, so not that I lived in downtown Toronto, but for 5 years of my life, I lived in Waterloo, where I had a very limited access to a vehicle. And on top of that, along with my student fees, a bus pass was included in that. So I had free access to the public transit system. And so I took advantage of that and I used it to do my groceries, sometimes even to get to campus, even though it was just like a 5 or 10 minute walk away. If I could, I would take public transit.
Why not? You pay for it.
Exactly. And so I really took advantage of that, and honestly, I could say that within the first 3 months that I was in Waterloo, I probably used public transit more then than I ever did in my life prior to that, which goes to show how little public transit I've actually used in the past. And from that point on, I definitely took an interest in public transit. And as I learned more about it and as I was exposed more to it and had the ability to use it more, I've honestly become such a huge advocate for it, as you know. Not only as an advocate for riding public transit, but just the implementation of public transit. I want everyone that can be involved to take part in supporting public transit.
Yeah, like I definitely agree with your notion of like public transit being the last resort. However, I also felt like growing up, there was definitely 2 tiers of public transportation in the suburbs. The first being like the inner city connections, which is like the GO train or the GO bus, which would take us from like our city to like downtown Toronto. And then there was like the within city one, which is like more so like for us really living in York Region, that would be like the YRT or like the Viva. And I feel like because of these 2 different tiers, like there was definitely different perceptions towards them, and I'll go into a bit more detail about those in a moment. But before I do, like I definitely agree, it's like it is extremely difficult to live in the suburbs without access to a car. Especially since everything is so spread out. Therefore, I've always associated like a car with not only like the wealth of a household, but also like personal power.
For sure, yeah.
And since we're yeah, and since we aren't able to drive until the age of 16, there was definitely this like additional mentality of like a before driver's and then after driver's license perspective on public transit.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like before having a driver's license, like there was less of a worry about personally having a car because you wouldn't be able to drive it.
Mm-hmm.
It was more so if like you could find someone that could drive it for you.
Right.
Therefore, before like because you need an additional connection to get to use that car,
Mm-hmm.
I think it was actually quite enjoyable to be able to take the bus, whether it was just like to go to the school or to go to the mall
Mm-hmm.
whenever we want on our own, because it felt like a small taste of like independence from our parents that like we could go places without them. And like because we're like 14 with little obligations, there's no feeling of like time crunch or whatever. So it's like taking the bus was just like a fun thing to do. Like, I remember, like, taking a bus for, like, a whole hour just to go to the mall in another town because we had the ability to do so.
Mm-hmm. Like, that was an adventure on its own.
Yeah. Yeah, like, we would spend a whole day just to, like, say, like, ride transit for 2 hours there and back, and to only do an activity for, like, 3 hours because that was just part of the adventure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but, like, that whole idea, like, totally changed after, like, turning 16. Because everyone started getting their driver's license, which means everyone could access their parents' cars.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, that is where, like, the two tiers come into play, where I feel like the intercity connections, such as the GO train and the GO bus, there was never a, like, idea where, like, oh, it was a last resort, because often it was the only way we could get to downtown Toronto, because like driving downtown is a hassle, whether that is like having to go on the highway, which a lot of people at 16 are not experienced with, or having to find a place to park their car. So like I feel like the GO train and the GO bus is always seen as like it was always okay. It was never shamed or never looked down upon, whereas like the local bus, such as like the YRT and Viva, it's like once you're able to drive and you tell your friends like, oh, I'm just gonna take the bus to go to that place, they'll be like, why are you taking the bus?
Yeah,
like it was definitely like, yeah, it was looked down upon, not only as in like a social capital sense, but also in like and like I guess like in the class sense when it comes to money. Yeah, so like as like so this is a quite common I guess perception or perspective that I've noticed that are located within a more suburban area. In comparison, as for like people living in a more urban area such as like downtown Toronto, I feel like there's a lot less of a belittling of people's dependency for public transit due to there is like a decreased dependency on the need for cars. And yeah, so having experience from like both perspectives, I think like the latter attitude of having like public transportation being a kind of like a key to a city is quite important, and the attitude that everyone should adopt.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think like as I began to learn more about public transit and the more I was able to experience it, I actually started to see access to public transit as more of a luxury than anything. Like back in Waterloo, I would see a lot of my professors actually take public transit to campus just because it was so much more convenient. And going back to like downtown Toronto, if you take the subway, for example, you can see so many people who are in business attire and just clearly on their way to work or business meetings just because of the way they're dressed. And you would think that people who are dressed like that would be able to afford vehicles. And they probably are, but rather than using these vehicles, they probably chose to take public transit because it's so much more convenient. They don't have to worry about where they have to put their car when they get to their destination. And so with that point in mind, I think public transit is definitely, as I grow up, seen more as a luxury than what I definitely viewed it as when I was younger.
Yeah.
And on that note, let's get into some of the benefits of public transit. So for me, I think that the biggest benefit for public transit is in terms of accessibility. And with accessibility in mind, I think this goes for specifically persons with disabilities. Let's say someone who isn't able to get a vehicle altered for their disability in order to be able to use it. Public transit is definitely one of the greater options they can choose to be able to still have their independence and get to where they need to go because they don't need to rely on other people. And another thing with accessibility being a big benefit of public transit is for individuals of marginalized communities, because ownership of a vehicle is often very expensive. And so being able to rely on public transit as a member of marginalized communities is really beneficial for them as well.
Yeah, so a second benefit is public transportation is an active method of transportation. So what that means is most often transit users are walking to and from their stations. So therefore, this daily act of walking actually encourages healthier habits, which then leads to potentially lower chronic diseases, a lower mortality rate, a happier disposition, and like overall just a more productive energy at work.
And I touched on this a little bit with the first benefit, but in terms of saving money, that is an entire benefit on its own, because with the cost of having a vehicle, there is not only the vehicle itself, but insurance that goes along with having the vehicle, finding a place to park the vehicle, having to pay for maintenance of the vehicle, and even gas, especially with gas prices in today's society, is just insane. So having to account for that along with the ownership of the vehicle, if you're able to take all of that out of your budgeting and use public transit, just think about how much money you're saving in the end.
Yeah, so like actually according to Stats Canada, like an average household that does not own a vehicle or one less vehicle they own is saving up to $10,000. So that's quite like a lot of money. Like that could go towards like maybe 3-4 months of rent for a whole household.
That's a lot of money.
So a fourth benefit is actually increased fuel efficiency. So what that means is that the more fuel efficient per passenger kilometer it is to carry people. So having such a bus or a subway, you're carrying about like maybe 100 times more people or like 50 times more people than an average car where only fits like 4 to 7 people. That is a major benefit, which leads into the fifth one.
So the fifth benefit that we came up with was reduced traffic congestion, and along with that is air pollution. So because as Andrea said, having public transit, you can carry so many more people than a single occupancy vehicle. It keeps to help congestion lower, which in turn reduces the amount of pollution that's being emitted into the air. And with that, designated lanes for public transit is also a big way to reduce traffic congestion, specifically with bus rapid transit, with the designated bus lanes, subways even, because it uses a totally different right of way, and even streetcars to some extent, because some portions of streetcars have their own designated lane. And so with that, they don't have to fight with other vehicles that are on the street to get to where they need to go. Especially in rush hour, you don't have to compete with the vehicles in the street if you have your own designated lane.
Yeah, so with that, it's like not only does it saves you a lot of travel time getting from point A to point B, but like because you're riding the bus or a public transportation system, you are freeing up your own personal time because you are not controlling the vehicle. So with that, you're able to take that time used in transit to either do some reading, do some working, or even nap. So overall, in the end, it just means like a lot more personal time is gained. As well, with a shorter travel time, like at your end of the day or at the beginning of the day, you have a bit more time to do whatever you like.
Yeah, I remember when I used to take the GO train from York Region down into Toronto every single morning. I would see the same, I'm assuming, high school chemistry teacher, just because I saw his notes. He would be marking tests every single day in the morning before he got to his school. And I thought this is such a good use of his time because my brother is also a teacher and he would often stay up until late hours of the night marking his students' work. And so the fact that this teacher that I saw every day on the train was able to make use of his time like that I just thought, how much more sleep is he getting than my brother? That is so lucky of him.
Yeah, like for me, it's like I never took the GO train to commute for work, but like when I did go downtown or have to go back uptown, I would always take advantage of the train to go take a nap.
Oh, because, wow, that's smart.
I guess like the smooth sailing or like the lull of the train just puts you to sleep, and like I personally don't sleep a lot at night because I'm a night owl, so like taking transit is a perfect time for me to catch up on my sleep.
Wow, yeah, that's you can do so much when you're not in charge and you don't need to pay attention to the road in front of you. Yeah. But let's go back to the benefits. So the 7th benefit that we're able to think of for public transit is that having public transit benefits communities financially. So for every $10 million of transit investment made, business sales increased by $30 million. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And on top of that, residential property, if located near a transit system, is on average 42% more valuable, which means cities reap greater tax revenues.
Yeah, but also like personal property tax, it's like your assets inflate as well.
Yeah, for sure, because if you're located near a transit station, the attraction to your property is much higher. So if you want to go and sell your property, there's a greater chance that someone will want to purchase your property, which is close to public transit, over another property which is farther away from public transit. Another point for that is that access to transit means greater access to higher paying jobs beyond the neighborhood. So if you're able to travel to a different city via public transit, you're able to get the benefits of having a job there, and so that increases as well. And for transit agencies and organizations, the fact that they can employ many people and create jobs for a lot more people is also another way to help communities financially.
Yeah, and the last point that we came up with is the social aspect. So we kind of talked about it when we saw, like, when you mentioned earlier about seeing the same teacher on the train. It's like, when you take public transit, you feel a part of the community, especially if you take it routinely on an everyday, like, timely schedule. It's like there is a feeling of increased connections with your neighbors because you're all using the same vehicle of, like, travel. And for me personally, like...
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, like, for me personally, like, when I was on co-op and I would... take the bus to go to work, it was nice to always to see my coworker who lived nearby like meet me at the bus station, and we would like take the bus together. So it's like every morning it's like you feel a part of where you are, and that's always nice.
Yeah,
so now that we've addressed some of the greatest benefits of public transit, we've also come up with some of the areas where we believe that there is a need for improvement. So the first one is poor scheduling or scheduling adherence. So there's two like thoughts to this. One is frequency. So for a local urban scale, such as in Toronto, the ideal, I think, time frequency for such a streetcar or bus is usually 10 minutes. However, sometimes that is very inconvenient when like there's only things available for 30 plus minutes. And I feel like this downfall is only like associated mostly with local urban transit systems, because intercity connections, they are often run at either 20 or 30 minute intervals and they never change, whereas like local buses and streetcars is quite unreliable because they don't have a set dedicated lane for them, so then they have to compete with other interfering factors such as cars. And the second part to these like poor scheduling is inconsistencies. So like a huge example of this was, for me personally, taking the number 6 bus that was located on Bay Street. And this bus is supposed to come like every 10 minutes, which is the ideal set times. However, on off days when there is a lot of traffic on Bay Street, there would be no buses for 30 minutes. But then all of a sudden, 30 minutes later, 3 buses would show up back to back to back. And it annoyed me so much because it's like, I'm going to be late for work now, and even though like all 3 buses ended up showing, the fact that you did not show up on time, you're impacting other people's schedules.
And so that is a big thing for schedule adherence, because even if the public transit agency is scheduling buses to arrive on time, the bunching of, for example, the 3 buses showing up together only occurs when the bus drivers don't adhere to the schedule that they're supposed to abide by. But this goes in line with, for example, the 30-minute allotment of the buses showing up. If, like, for us, 30 minutes is a long time for buses to show up. That's a huge chunk of time to have to wait. And so oftentimes I feel that bus drivers, if they see someone that's approaching their bus that is taking a while to arrive at their bus, they'll wait the 1 or 2 minutes or even maybe 5 minutes for those passengers to show up, because they don't want to wait for the passengers. They don't want the passengers to have to wait for the next bus. But in turn, instead of doing the good thing that they think they're doing, that is actually why the bunching occurs, because they're not sticking to the adherence.
Okay.
And so ultimately, this means that transit agencies have to choose between having frequent service with low ridership or less frequent service with a possibility of high ridership. So a way that I can definitely see this being improved is if public transit usage is more encouraged and ridership is increased to limit the chances of agencies losing money on running empty vehicles.
So a second area of improvement is cost. So riders, the average fare or the single adult fare for riding such as a bus or the subway, it really depends on where you're located. The YRT, for example, it costs on average a cash fare of $4.25. However, if you are a Presto user, which is a reloadable card, your fare is actually $3.88. And in comparison to a monthly pass, which is $154. And this is quite more, their cash fare is quite more expensive to, whereas, say, the TTC, where a cash fare would be $3.25 for an adult, and with a Presto you would get it at a discount for $3.20, so 5 cents off, and a monthly pass of $156. So when you look at these monthly passes, in order to make your money really worthwhile in comparison to such as the cash fare, you would have to take at least 48 trips or more to make it worthwhile. And that kind of comes out to like 24 days. And if you're able to take the transit 24 days to and from work, that is great. However, for those who don't rely on transit necessarily as going to work, or they don't work as many as 24 days, you're paying such a huge chunk of money that might not actually be worthwhile or give you a discount. And in addition, like, to these fares and how there is sort of a tier system to these fares, for a lot of people that are actually coming from outside of one region and going to another for works, such as relying on the GO train to take them, the average fare is actually really ranges from like $4 to $10, and it depends on how far you're coming from. But a lot of times when you're coming from these places outside of Toronto and arriving at Union Station, you would most often need to take the subway to get to your final destinations. And for a moment, there was actually a discount fare program where, like, if you're going from like the GO train to the TC, it only costs $1 to take the subway. However, that fare is now ended, so now that is like an additional $3 on top of your fare. So it's like you're paying like $15 potentially for one trip, which is quite a lot of money.
And so why we definitely think that this is an area for improvement is because it really ties into the topic of accessibility. Because of the absurd costs for riders, especially those who rely on transit to use it, it really takes away from how accessible transit should be for the public.
And as well as there not being a lot of accessibility when it comes to the cost of transit, there is also a lack of routes in certain areas.
And so again, this goes back to poor ridership, because if ridership is low, a transit agency can't really justify keeping routes in certain areas just because of the business aspect of it, or even adding stops in certain areas if the ridership is low. So this means that passengers could potentially walk a lot longer to get to a stop than it is for them to take the public transit to their destination. And so if the use of public transit could somehow be encouraged more in that people would want to use it, I think only then could this improve. So then now let's talk about how the public can be encouraged to use public transit. As we mentioned, it seems as if it's an endless battle of who's going to take the first step for a pro-public transit area. Realistically, it really should be the people who have the greatest amount of power to do the influencing. So let's get into some of the ideas of why we think urban areas should invest in their public transit systems.
Yeah, so our belief is that it is the job of urban areas to invest in public transit systems, because the more money to create better infrastructure that goes towards such as scheduling, station locations, system maintenance, and etc., the more users will actually want to ride it, and therefore more revenue. So it's like sort of like a catch-22 where you actually need to put in the money in order more money to come back. And like citizens will not choose public transportation if it is not reliable enough to get them from point A to point B. And the second reason is that better public transportation infrastructure actually allows for a much higher density urban development, which reduces the economic and environmental costs of suburban sprawl. And like preventing this suburban sprawl will also allow for reducing of like a lack of routes in certain areas, and therefore overall promotes more cohesion and sustainable communities.
And on top of that, when public transit is encouraged in an area and the urban area actually invests in the area, it gives that area the opportunity to develop as a transit hub, which in turn increases not only tourism towards the area, but it could also lead to greater economic stimulation.
Yeah, so like if you look at Yonge Street in Toronto as an example, you can tell where a lot of investment has been made towards public transit, and especially in the uptown neighborhoods such as like Yonge and Eglinton, where currently they're building an Eglinton crosstown that meets where the subway station, and as well as like Yonge and Fitch. These are both big mobility hubs in sort of a semi-suburban, semi-urban area, and there is a lot more job opportunities, a lot more actually community or life happening there because of its connection to transportation.
And I know, like, personally, I would much rather want to go to an area, let's say whether this be a restaurant or a bar or even just a store that is steps away from a transit stop than maybe even a better restaurant or a better store that is a 10-minute walk away from a transit station, just because I think the time that it takes to get from the stop to the actual destination is so much more valuable.
So yeah, and also like you have the freedom of like after going to the restaurant, maybe you want to go for dessert, so you can, because you know that there is a reliable way to get home like every 10 minutes. So you're not like on a time crunch thinking, okay, no, I have to go because my parking is going to expire.
Yeah, for sure.
So, like, with that being said, like, there was a tweet that was written out by Brant Torian, who was a past Vancouver city planner, that kind of, like, questions our cities or asks the city our question. It's like, when it comes to supporting public transit, there are two kinds of cities. There is one that support transit as a key element of a successful city, and there's two. There's one that support transit as long as it doesn't inconvenience the primacy of private vehicle movements and budgets. So our question for you guys is, what type of city will yours be? Will you invest in public transit or will you not?
So if you've listened this far, we're going to leave you with that, and that was the plan for now. Listen to our next episode to continue figuring it out with us.
Thanks for following along to this episode. If you liked it, please give it a like, a review, or subscribe for more. And until then, follow us on Instagram at What's the Plan Podcast for what the next plan is.